Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic Re.Con, Testimonies from Reverts and Converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask, and today I've got two special guests, Father Peter Davids and his wife, Judy. And Father Peter reached out, I believe, through an email. This was a while back, and I remember doing some quick research on Father Peter and realizing that his story was very, very layered. I know that many people that I've interviewed can say, okay, I've got a lot of layers to my story, but this specifically was very striking, and I'm just honored to have both of you here. And I know that there are so many people of all ages that can benefit from your wisdom, from your journey. So like I do with everyone, why don't you tell me, where did this journey begin? I'm assuming you have very fond memories of the Protestant faith, but yeah, you tell me, where do you believe this thing all started?
Well, I would say that it started almost, really before our birth, before my birth anyway, in some ways, because my family had been part of the Plymouth Brethren for a number of years. Now, the Plymouth Brethren were an ecumenical movement from the early 1800s. They were the origin, or at least the origin of the popularization of dispensationalism, if for those who know what that is, and started in Britain. And but it is important to note two things, well, three things I'll say about them. One is that they were an attempt to be ecumenical. In these last days, we need to get the church together. And so how did you do it? You dropped all your liturgies and met together in primitive simplicity and let the Spirit lead. That was the idea. And but the second one is, with that, what you met around was the Lord's Supper. You met around the table. And the third was, after they got going, and basically most of the people were told it's either that group or our group, the church, the Methodist or the Baptist or whatever other group you were in. It became clear that they saw themselves as a renewal movement, or a waiting renewal movement, over against the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And so they called themselves assemblies. We are an assembly of people gathered outside the church, waiting for the Lord to come and renew his church, which is in ruins. Now, Catholic was not part of that. Catholic was the Church of England. And so we did not have technically elders in the early days. We had people who did the work of elders. And we also had no pastors. Because only the Episcopal Church, only the Church of England could ordain. And so you couldn't have a true presbyter or, pastor or elder of any type. Okay. Quick switch to the US. My father immigrated to the US. My mother's parents, who were not Plymouth Brethren, had come to the US, New York State. And it was there that my father met my mother, of course. They got married in 1941. And not long afterward, my father was transferred. He was an electronic engineer to Syracuse, New York, where there wasn't a Plymouth Brethren church, but he started one. Tent meetings, apparently. I cannot believe this, but my parents have sworn to it. And so my mother played the piano, my father preached, some people gathered, and that was our small community But my father always in Syracuse taught a Sunday school class for the Wesleyan Methodist Church downtown. And we often went to, on Sunday evenings, went to other churches, but worship was the breaking of bread in the morning, in the rooms in, well, several places, but the earliest one I remember is the YMCA. Now, meanwhile, down in Texas, Judy.
Yeah, my mother was raised Baptist. My father was raised Methodist. But at the age of 14, his neighbors took him to a Plymouth Brethren camp, and he experienced a conversion. And then started going to the Brethren church. And when he met my mother, he took her into the Brethren church. So I was dedicated as an infant in the Plymouth Brethren church and made a confession of faith when I was 9 in that church. When I was 11, I was baptized and received my first communion. And when I was 12, kneeling at a tree stump, now why I knelt, I don't know. Except maybe that's some of my Catholic bones that I didn't know about. But I knelt at a tree stump in the woods at a camp near Dallas, Texas called Cedar Hill Bible Camp, and promised the Lord, I will be your missionary. I will go anywhere. I will do anything you ask me. And I surrendered to him at that point. I was a faithful church member. We were sort of at the church every time the doors opened because my father was an elder and he was a director of Texas youth camps. Because that's where he became a Christian. He dedicated himself to youth camps in his own ministry, but worked as a chemical operator at Roman Haas Chemical Company on the Houston Ship Channel. So I went off to Wheaton College, a Christian college in Illinois, and there I met Peter Davids.
Okay. Well, if you go back to my story was I would also have been dedicated, I believe, because I know that was important to my father in the case of one of our children who is now deceased, but died of crib death. I do not remember a time when I did not believe. I can remember times when I was around 4 or 5, proudly saying to my mother that I had sung all the songs in church. I also knew that when I was 1, I have a brother 5 years older than me, and my mother pinned me under one arm and read Bible stories. These would have been Bible story books, but King James language, of course.
Sure.
Is there anything other? Back in those days, I mean, we're talking about,
Yeah.
a while ago. She noticed that actually fairly quickly that when she would be going through the book again, I would show recognition of the character. So she thought she was just keeping me quiet, keeping me out of the way and out of trouble. In fact, I was apparently learning, much to her surprise. There was always Bible reading. Either the earliest things I can remember is pulling a card out of a box which had verses on it, sort of promise verses. Later it would be reading around the table a chapter. But I don't remember a time when I didn't believe. I had what I call well-meaning spiritual abuse when I was about age 5, where a Sunday school teacher, and there couldn't have been many of us in the class, knowing the size of the church, said to us, if you don't, if you haven't asked Jesus into your heart, the rapture will come and your parents will be taken and you'll be left behind. And she left it there.
Wow.
Which just absolutely terrified me, obviously, because I mean, I believed. It wasn't anything I didn't believe. I was, anyway. And so I did at home in secret for a week or 2 or 3 afterwards, asked Jesus into my heart several times as I went to try to go to sleep.
Yeah.
But of course, you know, asking Jesus into your heart isn't something you find in the Bible.
That's true. Yeah.
It's just that he comes in is in the Bible, but asking him is that no conversion story in the Bible does that. But at any rate, that's why I say it was abuse, because it didn't change my state. I didn't believe anything differently. I wasn't committed in any different way. When I was about 14, we had moved to Lynchburg, Virginia, and we're going to a Plymouth Brethren church in Roanoke, Virginia. And in Lynchburg, yes, we did know of, we did sometimes go to church in the evening in Lynchburg, in which case one of the places was Thomas Road Baptist Church. And so we did know Jerry Falwell in his younger years.
Yeah.
I knew both of his sons as, you know, essentially little boys. I would have been a teenager. Well, I would have been 12 and up until I left for university then. At any rate, 14, I said to myself one summer, you know, it's time to get serious about your faith. In other words, I've been going along, doing everything expected, living a, you know, a believing life, but I realized that I hadn't sort of, in a mature way, that it was a child's faith. You know, it was, which Jesus likes, but that I had to, you know, move forward in it.
Sure.
And so I made that decision. I just said, okay, it's time to get serious. And leaving the faith, you know, either get serious or drop it. Leaving the faith just wasn't an option. And so I did several things. One is I started observing the Fundamentalist 5, you know, which were, you know, well, I didn't have any problem with drinking or playing cards. They wouldn't have been in our house. Even though my parents were not true fundamentalists, for them it wasn't an absolute. For them, it was something you did in America because it was expected. And I did stop going to dances with my girlfriend.
Now, what are, just so the listeners know, what are the Fundamentalist 5?
No drinking, dancing, going to movies or other types of theater, going to dances,
Smoking,
no smoking,
and no playing cards.
no playing cards, using, you know, when we got to Wheaton,
No gambling.
they would have that. They would have that in Wheaton as well as part of the pledge.
Yeah,
but in Wheaton,
Really, you had to sign a pledge. Okay.
in Wheaton College, they would have they would play cards using rook cards, so they weren't using the wrong type of cards.
Got it.
But at any rate, and which led to the end of my relationship with that girlfriend. But more importantly, I asked the elders of our church for baptism and for to come into fellowship. When you came into fellowship, you not only could partake of communion, but as an adult male, you're considered an adult male then, as an adult male, you could stand up and say, let us sing hymn so-and-so,
Okay.
or stand up and give a prayer, or read from scripture, or, essentially all ministries were open to you.
And how often, when you mentioned Holy Communion, how often was reception?
Every week.
It was
Is
every
there
week.
any type of worship?
Well,
Any other type of worship?
yeah, every week. That's right. That's right.
Where
I
And
mean,
wow. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
that's a setup for the Catholic Church, but I didn't know it.
we didn't know that then.
Well, I was curious because there have been
Yeah.
people all over the map saying
Yeah.
even a denomination that I assumed would be more frequent was every 6 weeks sometimes, or once a month. So
Yeah.
I was just curious
Oh,
where
oh.
they landed on that.
And if you were really part of the church, you were at the breaking of bread. They did have, and not all brethren churches would in the morning, but the one which we did, had a family Bible hour, which would look like a typical preaching service.
Okay.
At a, say, Baptist or other church like that. But that was seen more as gospel outreach. It wasn't really seen as as worship.
Got it.
And at any rate, in my case, I was actually led into fellowship first. And because the baptistry had broken in our church, and so we didn't, they said, we're building a new church, we're not going to fix the baptistry, you can come into fellowship. And after asking me a few questions and finding out that my faith was pretty solid. After all, I had been listening to my father at home as well as in the church. He was one of the more frequent preachers. And earlier years, my disobedience would be sneaking down the stairs a little bit so I could listen through the banister as my father taught a Bible class in our living room.
That's horrible. How dare you do that?
I was supposed to be in bed anyway.
Yeah. I know. That's just, yeah, it could be.
But at any rate, so that's what happened. That's what happened. And then shortly after I would be baptized in January when we moved into the new church by my father. And shortly after that, the elders came to 3 young men. I was the youngest at 15. My older brother was the oldest, and there was one which we in between called Dickie Adams. And they said, would you young men take the Sunday evening gospel service, where no one who wasn't a Christian came to, but we still called it the gospel service. And it was where the most hard-bitten of the church members came, so we couldn't damage anyone's faith. Will you take that in turn, preaching once a month, and then get the other young people, including some of the young women, to be involved in music and so on. And so we did.
At 15.
At 15, though I wouldn't preach on Sunday morning until I was 16, which was my 16th birthday was November 22nd, 1963, which may ring in your head a little bit.
Say it again. 63.
November 22nd, 1963.
Yes.
Yes.
And Kennedy.
Yep.
And of course, I didn't know two much more influential people or at least one of them in my life died that day, besides Kennedy. One was C.S. Lewis.
Yes, I was going to say, wasn't there
Was
three?
Aldous Huxley.
Yep, Huxley. That's right.
But at any rate, the Sunday after that, that was a Friday, the Sunday after that was my first Sunday morning sermon. And so I've been preaching ever since.
Let me ask you this. So regardless of age, what direction were you given? Or was it, how did they approach
As the Lord
commentary, and where
leads.
did you go? Go ahead and say, what was that?
As the Lord leads.
As the Lord leads. Okay. Would you be confined to a few verses, or would this be, hey, here's a book of the Bible, good luck?
Oh, I could do whatever the Lord led me to do.
Okay. So not even with, I was wondering if there were any parameters. Just
Usually we put verses together,
Sure.
but I know that that first one was on 1 Timothy, or is on some themes which I spotted through 1 Timothy. I can remember that much. I have it somewhere on tape. If I want to humble myself, I play it. It was, I think, I mean, they thought it was fine. I thought it was awful. Now, in retrospect.
sure.
But that summer, the next summer, again, I was 16, I went off to a National Science Foundation sort of experience in Carnegie Mellon University, or Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Institute of Technology as it was then, in Pittsburgh. I wanted to be an electronic engineer, so I was all into sciences. I went off there, and I was helping a graduate student in his doctoral work. I was the lab grunt, and they gave us time on computers, which in those days were rooms full, and
Yeah.
so on. And it was a fascinating experience. But on the way home to my dorm from the dining hall with two other students, I was one of two students out of the 20 of us who was not an atheist. The other one was a Catholic, so I wasn't entirely sure he was a Christian.
Yeah.
We didn't talk the same language.
Yeah.
But at any rate, I'm walking home and God speaks to me in my head. Now, remember, we didn't believe that things like visions or revelations or anything like that existed.
The Plymouth Brethren.
The Plymouth Brethren didn't. They were gift cessationists.
Cessationists. Yep. Yep.
And they weren't originally, but after, during their early years, they shifted to that. Originally, it was the duty of all Christian men in these last days to pray to the Lord for the restoration of the gifts of the Spirit.
Got it. Interesting.
But they certainly weren't expecting them in my day. But I just knew it was God. And God, as I said, spoke to me in my head, and he said, "You don't want to be an engineer, do you?" And I saw myself behind a big desk, and I was essentially chained to the desk by a slide rule.
Oh, man.
And those, if you're, again, old enough, you'd know the slide rule was the best calculator we had for those periods, that period. And I'd never thought this in my life before. My older brother was in training to be an engineer. I was going, really was already talking about which college I was going to. And my father had been one all his life. And I said, "No, I don't want that." I just knew I didn't.
Yeah.
And he said, "But I've called you to study Bible." Now that was a problem. I didn't know where to study Bible. I had no idea. I had no idea why you would study Bible. I mean, everybody should be reading the Bible at home and studying. My father had a biblical library and so on. But I just said, okay. When I got to my dorm room, I wrote my usual Friday letter to my parents and said, I'm not going to these schools we've been talking about. I'm going to the only place I could remember that I'd ever heard of anyone studying Bible, which was Philadelphia College of the Bible. I had a camp counselor who was a teacher there, I think, at one point, years before. At any rate, and, you know, dropped the bomb in the mail. And but that Sunday, we had a visiting preacher at the Plymouth Brethren Church I went to, who said, Emmaus Bible School needs teachers. And he prefaced that by saying, I don't know why I'm saying that. And I felt like an arrow had gone into my heart, you know, teaching Bible. You study it to teach it, you know. I mean, God didn't say you knew, but you know, as I said, I didn't know about seminaries, didn't know about any of this. I think I may have heard that Jerry Falwell had gone to a Bible college.
Got it.
I may have heard that. But again, he didn't have much formal biblical education himself. At any rate, that next year, I somehow discovered Wheaton College, and that's where I ended up going.
Wait, so this was at that point, you're 18?
I would have been 17.
17.
Yeah.
You meet Judy as a 17-year-old or 18?
No, in Wheaton, I was actually a psych major. I ended up being a psych major, but at any rate, I was walking across campus with a Bible prof, the head of the Bible department, during I think it was my first term, towards the end of my first term. At any rate, and he said to me, from his observations of me in class and knowing that, you know, where I was interested in, he said, Peter, I think you're going to get a doctorate. Now, this is from a guy I didn't even know you could get a degree. Before, you know, 6-8 months beforehand, you're going to get a doctorate. He says it's a long road. He was thinking of Dallas Theological Seminary, where he had graduated from. He said, shave a year off while you can. If you take summer schools, they're actually cheaper at Wheaton. And shave a year off while you can. So what I did, you know, I was 17. I guess I would have been 18, because I would have turned 18 after I was in Wheaton in November. But I was just 18. I started to accelerate. My parents didn't know why I would do that. They had enough money to send me through. And, you know, if that's what I wanted to do, fine, you know. And they were behind me. That summer in summer school, I bumped into her.
Right.
Literally?
Almost.
Now, I was in a different position because I was older than Peter, and I was
3 years.
behind a semester in university. So I wanted to go to summer school to make up that semester and graduate with my class. So I had a little part-time job in the university cleaning tape recorders. And my boss was going to the dining room and going to meet a friend. And we finished about the same time. So he said, you want to come over and have dinner with my friend and I? So we walked across and he introduced me to Peter. And he and Peter got into this crazy philosophical.
No, Peter, you and he.
Tim and I got into this conversation, and Tim was trying to convince me that women were an idea in the mind of men, and I was telling him he was crazy.
He was also trying to convince you that you shouldn't date anyone.
Oh, right. He had this crazy idea the Lord would tell you who to marry.
You tell a man.
And he would go up and tap the girl on the shoulder and say, hey, the Lord just told me to marry you. What's your name, by the way? So anyway, we got into this crazy conversation at dinner, and we walked back to the dormitory where we were both living. And I parted from those two guys. They went to the men's side and I went to the women's. And I turned around to Peter and I said, well, I'll pray for you. I just thought he was so crazy.
Because I thought Tim was nuts, but he was my friend.
Yeah.
I supported him.
Anyway.
But at any rate, 5 days later, he comes to me, and there was a girl there too, another one of the co-eds, I think essentially my class. And she had decided that God had said to her that she should marry Tim.
Tim's theory in reverse.
Tim wanted to detach her. And I said, Tim, I don't know anything about women, and I'd grown up with 3 boys, so that's pretty well true. It was truer. I would find out more. That was how true that was once I got married. But anyway, Tim, I don't know anything about women. He said, so ask a woman. Well, who can I ask? And I had somehow sensed that she was going to be a counselor. That would actually happen years later. But anyway, wow. I had sensed that in her. I said, go ask Judy Bushelon. And, I couldn't do that. I said, Tim, I will ask her for you if you really want. And he said, would you? And so we arranged to meet after prayer meetings. We were actually going to different Plymouth Brethren churches, but both had a Wednesday night prayer meeting. And we met in the one nearest the campus after the Wednesday night prayer meeting, discovered we were both brethren, and suddenly I became okay for her.
Because in my Plymouth Brethren church, it was thought you needed to marry a Plymouth Brethren guy to really be a good Christian.
Got it.
And so when I found out he was Plymouth Brethren, he's okay.
So
I knew my dad would like it.
The long and short of it was 14 days later or 19 days after we met, we were engaged.
Oh, man.
I was of 18. And a year after that, or 401 days after we met, we were married.
So that was 67?
Yeah, that was 67.
1960.
And that would be between my summer school and the time she had to report to teach in the next town to Wheaton. She graduated.
So, okay. So you're super young. I wonder if, because I want to make sure that we have time for the Catholic part of things, if you were to box up the next, I don't know, you tell me, 20, 30 years, was it Plymouth all the way? No.
What happens is, over those next years, is I go on to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Okay. There, influential professors, one of which was Plymouth Brethren, shift some of my thinking. Suddenly I became gospel-centered rather than Pauline-centered, which is very important. And the second thing was I began seeing how the New Testament, the Old Testament was interpreted by the New. And so I began to have a whole, what I would now call theodrama exegesis and so forth. At the end of that time, I was going on to England for study in New Testament or biblical studies at the University of Manchester, the doctorate. And I got books of a couple of classic books of worship. I realized, I've learned about these other denominations. I should see their classic literature. One was the Book of Common Prayer. Because my background is British, I was actually a British citizen. I didn't know it at that point, but I was, because my father was born in Britain. And at that point, I was in Britain. I started using it in my devotions. And I also got exposure to the Anglican Church there. My actual supervisor, which wasn't F.F. Bruce, he was the head of the department, but was S.S. Smalley, was a Anglican priest, even though we didn't talk about it, but I got to know what he was like. And secondly, we became friends with Anglican priest down at Curate, down the road, through two of our children, his child and my child, who both went to the same nursery school together, my eldest. And I actually preached in his church a couple of times, but this was low church Anglican. I mean, this was really low, so it wouldn't have been any communion. Went over, my first job was in Germany. I went over to Germany. This was in a Brethren/Baptist college, what we would call Bible college now. It's now actually considered university level. And there, several things happened to us. One, I learned about Christian social concern. Second, we had I had first and her then a charismatic experience.
Okay.
However, it was in the context of the of a German group, actually a German Baptist group, for which it was very much contemplative.
Okay.
So contemplation and prayer were sort of merged very much. Third, we discovered the classic spiritual tradition. Now, while it was through literature from the US, namely the Sojourners community in Washington, D.C., that I learned about some of this literature, I quickly was reading stuff from that tradition. And Judy goes to a ecumenical charismatic retreat down at Schloss Castle, Schloss's castle in German, Graheim, and comes back with a book for me.
It was led by a Catholic priest and a Catholic nun. And I didn't realize how much their contemplative spirituality influenced me, but it influenced me deeply. And I did pick up this book that they had recommended during the conference and took it back to Peter for him to read.
And it was Carlos Correcto. Carlos Correcto had followed in the footsteps of Charles de Foucault. And he had, and in his book, he wrote about, one of the things he wrote about was he's in the Algerian desert as a monk. He has left a big youth ministry in Italy for this. He is kneeling on the sand floor of a rude chapel before the Blessed Sacrament, and it put a hook in my heart. I didn't know what to make of it, but it put a hook in my heart. I could not forget that image. No picture, just its description.
Unbelievable.
While on a retreat myself, a fasting retreat there, God spoke to me and said, again, it was one of these things, when God really knows that I won't do it on my own, won't come up with the ideas on my own, he sort of uses a 2x4 over the head and speaks. And he said, I want you to join the Episcopal Church.
Episcopal Church.
Now, anyway, that started a process. The long and short of it is, we heard of a new Episcopal seminary starting in the Pittsburgh area.
Okay.
And I wrote the dean president, who was the only staff member at the time, and said, what is this? A evangelical Episcopal seminary? Can there be such a thing? Not a word about what, about me or that call or anything.
Sure.
And he writes back and says, how would you like to be our first professor of biblical studies?
Yeah, crazy.
Crazy. Now he had checked me out a little bit.
I want to insert one little
Yeah,
story.
yeah.
We had a visitor from Australia in our living room, and we were talking about Peter having written Bishop Stanway, and this visitor knew him, knew he'd planted 25 churches in Tanzania, knew him, that he was a great Christian, devoted man, and could tell us, yeah, you want to be involved with that man. And so I thought later, God sent an angel and told us all about Bishop Stanway.
The other thing which I'll mention is the thing which he didn't, is that he worked several, I'll call miracles.
Yeah.
That made my leaving Vedenness after only 2 years.
God worked miracles.
God, yeah, it was God made the top man there say, you know, we didn't want Peter to go, but it is of God. You know, God has spoken. We cannot say no.
I'm just amazed that you get such clear direction about Episcopal Church,
Yeah.
and then in hindsight to realize what that all means, to have that as kind of a one of your rest stops, so to speak, in the journey.
So we went there. We were there 7 years. First I was ordained in the Episcopal Church a couple of years after doing that, ordained as a transfer of ordination. I had been a brethren chaplain in the military, not full-time. I'd been part-time even while I was in Germany.
Got it.
In the reserves, but still. Secondly, we did have the crib death of our third daughter there, and that really changed me into a pastor.
And I had a Catholic doctor, Dr. Sabatel, and he sent me a card after this crib death saying he had a mass said for Elizabeth. And I thought, oh, how sweet of him. But later, after becoming Catholic, I realized, wow, God was doing things that I had no idea what he was doing. But that was just a little seed.
Yeah, the little seeds. Yeah.
To have this Catholic doctor, and he prayed for me because I had a miscarriage after that, and then couldn't get pregnant again for a while, and it was a very low period in my life when Elizabeth died. But God was at work. And he
Yeah.
planted a little Catholic seed during that time.
And another seed that was planted is an Episcopal pastor from Philadelphia that just really had met me once, and he had a big healing ministry dating back to the 30s in Philadelphia in his Episcopal church, but connected with the Eucharist. And he sent us, let's see, one, two, three, four, five crucifixes, real cheap crucifixes in an envelope. Scrawled on the envelope was, "God lost his son too." In an envelope, sent it to us. My first crucifix.
Incredible, yeah. Absolutely.
And when I was ordained in 1979, 1980, I went down to Steubenville to the National Catholic Charismatic Conference for priests and deacons. Because because it was charismatic, but also because the main speaker was an Episcopal priest.
No kidding.
Terry Fulham from Darien, Connecticut. And but also Michael Scanlon was there, and so on, Father Scanlon, and so on, all these sort of things. I mean, there's 800 priests and mostly priests there, and 80 are Episcopalian, or I think a couple of those 80 were Lutheran.
So everyone was playing along nicely in that period?
Oh man, we were more than playing along nicely. I thought in the worship that had I seen angels sliding down the tent poles. It was held in a huge tent outside.
No kidding.
I wouldn't have been surprised and say, "Oh yeah, let's see it." This sort of thing. We had small groups together, and we, irrespective of denomination, we prayed. But that year, for the first time, they were, because of a papal nuncio that had come through, they were forced at the main Eucharist we were forced to separate. And so at the offertory, us 80 processed out of the tent to a room in the university somewhere, and the rest stayed in the tent, and both sides were crying.
That just, wow. Kind of reminds me of RCIA, the candidates and
before that, they had Episcopal altar here, Catholic altar there, Catholic priest mic'd, Episcopal priest mumbles. And you were supposed to go to your right altar, and so on. But
that is fascinating. Altars set up.
But here we had to separate, and I started praying for the unity.
Yeah.
For unity. These are my brothers. These are my brothers. I am one of them, and we got to get over this thing. And at that point, I didn't realize that my orders were invalid. It wouldn't have been until really pretty close to the time I became a Catholic priest that I would read that particular papal document. I think it was an encyclical. But
no, I was going to say, now, do you think that it's so, the way you're describing that, you're so close in a sense to this unity. Do you think in any way that those moments delayed conversion ultimately to the Catholic faith?
They delayed it in this way, in that I hoped that we would somehow get together. Secondly, I was deeply involved in biblical studies. I was a professor, While I was a professor, I would teach John. I would teach, Revelation. And so Father Raymond Brown changed my mind on John 6. And so I believes it.
Yeah.
You know, and I often taught it, even in places where it would have seemed strange.
Like in the Baptist University.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would have, Mary is in Revelation 12.
Hmm.
There you see, you know, she is essentially Queen of Heaven. And you get all these images there. She is the mother of the church because they're her children that are being persecuted and so on. And so there's all sorts of ways that would that I would be changing. And of course we were constantly reading things. I was reading the Desert Fathers, I was reading Francis of Assisi, I was reading other things like that.
So how did you, in that period, how were you reconciling that with the Anglican / Episcopalian church? I'm just
Well,
curious.
we're really one.
Say it again.
We're really one, I would say. It's just so those, you know, top snots have to get their acts together.
I guess that's what I'm asking. Yeah.
Yeah,
Were you aware of that,
really.
of that portion of it, or is it? Yeah, go ahead, Judy.
Yeah.
And while Peter was teaching at in Vancouver,
Well, this would be years later in Vancouver, Regent College in Vancouver.
Regent
Okay.
College.
Yeah.
I took some courses called the Christian Spirit and Spirituality. And my professor happened to be British, but he started class one day by saying, I've fallen in love with a woman who's not my wife. And then he told us that he was speaking of Teresa of Avila. And he also said, now I want you to write a term paper, and if you have any trouble deciding what to write, come see me. So I went and visited him, and I came out of his office with a stack of books this high. I don't know how many on Teresa, but several other spirituality books. And I started a journey that day of reading what I call as a Protestant, the spiritual classics.
Got it.
And Teresa influenced me tremendously in my faith. And actually, as I got deeper and deeper into reading St. John of the Cross, Francis de Sales, you know, just a whole bunch of the Protestant classics.
Yeah, spiritual classics. Yeah.
And spiritual classics. They were feeding my soul. But I had no idea that I was gradually stepping towards the Catholic Church.
No, I was actually had been teaching since my Trinity day in those Pittsburgh days. I had started teaching spirituality or prayer as well, history of Christian spirituality or history of prayer, and using the classics as well. One of my horrors with the evangelical Episcopal people, by the way, is that they did not celebrate the Eucharist every Sunday.
Because we were centered around
We were more
the worship service.
I was, you know, sort of higher church. I knew some high church people that did. I went to confession once a year. I would work through Ignatius's spiritual exercises during Lent.
Wow.
And then in Holy Week, I went to Anglo-Catholic priest I knew across Pittsburgh, and he would hear my confession. And then we'd have lunch together afterwards. And like a good priest, he never mentioned a thing he had heard, even to me.
Yeah. Wow.
And so I've been having some of these experiences, though it was a Baptist professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School was the first one who talked about confession to us. He had talked about the necessity of confession in people who were feeling guilt over serious sins.
And yeah, if you remember, would he often reference like John 20:23, or would he speak more of tradition and how it's good for the soul? I mean, I'm just curious.
He was just saying this is necessary. He was saying somebody comes in and has this burden. He says, put on your suit coat or your pulpit robe. You know, he's talking to Protestants, whatever you use on Sunday morning, take them out into the church in front of whatever table you use for communion.
Yeah.
Have them kneel there and, confess their sins and so on, and, pronounce them forgiven in the name of God.
Wow.
You're speaking from a pastoral point of view.
Sure. And
for their soul's sake.
He was a Baptist. But anyway, I'd had my experiences back in Trinity. We went on. I would teach in Regina at a Christian Missionary Alliance school that was somewhat interdenominational. We would go back to the Vancouver area in Canada, and I would be teaching people who had come up through the ranks at Vineyard Church there. And even though I was an Episcopal priest, I would always go to and sometimes serve at the local Anglican church. You know, if he needed me, I would serve. I would be the presider. If otherwise, I was there, and so I was always part. But then I would be back at the vineyard, and something had happened during this time that was important for her. While we were in Regina, she had been doing counseling, right? And you had a burnout.
Oh, yes. I crashed and burned. And I had a counseling teacher in Vancouver that I called up and said, what do I do? And he said, well, come to this conference. There's a seminar on burnout. So I went to the seminar and got some counseling, personal counseling there. And the counselor said, go to a spiritual director, take a whole year off. You are burned to a crisp, but go to a spiritual director. So we went back home to Regina, and I went into the seminary where he taught, and I said, where do I find a spiritual director in Regina, Saskatchewan? And they said, you'll have to go to the Catholics. So I went to a convent.
That sounds funny. Go ahead. Yeah. You'll have
they assigned me to Sister Harriet, and she saw me every Friday morning for a whole year. And she began to catechize me. I didn't realize what she was doing, but she led me into silence, solitude, retreating, contemplative prayer. And she just quietly shared her faith and would answer my questions. How do I find God? And, my prayers just hit the ceiling and bounce back down at this point. And so she just, led me very gently into the Catholic Church. Now, the crazy thing about that for me is I never realized consciously how Catholic I was becoming. But I was just, taking step by step, closer and closer and closer.
So what year was that? What year was that? So when you were meeting with her, and then when
90 to 91.
90 to 91, and then how many years later did you?
2014.
2014.
Okay, but during that 20 plus year stretch, you were you were following that same kind of pattern of what she taught you.
I was constantly reading the spiritual classics.
Yep.
And when I burned out, I, actually made my first silent retreat for a week at a monastery. She sent me to this monastery, and it was an amazing experience. She had me meditating on a verse in Psalm chapter 46, verse 11, be still and know that I am God. And I had meditated on that for 3 months. And then she sent me on this retreat, and I went, knelt in the chapel there at this monastery and looked up at the altar, and above the altar in 1 foot high green letters were the words, be still and know that
What?
I began to cry. I realized God had my number.
Yeah.
And he wanted me to heal. And so that silent retreat started me on retreating myself. And then later I led retreats, incorporating all the spiritual lessons that Sister Harriet had taught me.
Oh my goodness, I love
Yeah.
that. And I'm sure, go ahead.
You're gone.
I was just gonna say, I'm sure all the spiritual classics, as you say, were helpful. But I think of, the burnout and how St. John of the Cross can pause, pray, play. I didn't even know that you had a book.
This documents my burnout, and then all the lessons I learned and how I created the retreats.
Wow.
When you mention all that, I think of the Dark Night of the Soul and the Purgative Way, and then the Illuminative Way, and then also De Sales and how he, in his introduction to the devout life, how he was so, he's addressing Philomena, and he's so careful, so tender, and it's not just for her. I mean, she represents everyone, and in these incredibly difficult times, how to draw inward, not to be more self-loving, draw inward to understand who you are and be comfortable in silence and be able to examine your motives and all this peace that comes from doing that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we went back to, as I said, we went back and we're working for Vineyard. She was counseling. And then when I was also teaching for Region too. When I was laid off there, they laid off because of a financial crisis. They laid off all specialists. I was invited over to Austria to help rebuild theological education in Eastern Central Europe. And, this was after the fall of the wall.
Yeah.
And so we lived in a castle in Austria and then later down in Innsbruck. But during that time, we had good ecumenical relations with the Catholic Church. And really, I would say now a little bit too good, because the local pastor had no trouble serving communion to me, knowing, or her for that matter, knowing precisely who we were, and so on. And in fact, I saw he would have an ecumenical mass once a year, and in that mass, his essentially concelebrant was the Lutheran pastor in town, and I would go to the Lutheran church.
This is starting to blow my mind. I'm like, what?
And so these are, again, relationships. And of course, we went down to when we were in Innsbruck, I saw my first Corpus Christi procession, except a little bit different. They first thing, it was, you're walking, taking up whole streets of the city. They were walking, I was observing.
Yeah. And
of course, the monstrance that had to be carried by several people, when they would stop and they would have prayers and things. And I saw one of these, the Austrian National Guard from the Napoleonic era, which was marching along with them, would, as they raised the monstrance, they would, you would hear the guns click and the muskets go off. And actually back in up in the hills in Middersill, at major masses like that ecumenical one, you would also have that happen at the elevation of the host. And so outside the church, you would expect bells to ring, instead you had guns shoot.
That is surreal. Wow.
It was surreal, but it certainly gave me another. I was walking by Karl Rahnerplatz all the time, you know, and so all these names were familiar. I was reading, you know, a lot of course, theology and so on all the time. We went, and I was working, I did some of the time there, I was working for the German-speaking vineyard movement, which was really a movement and had some small groups that were Catholic in Catholic parishes. They weren't churches, you know,
yeah.
They were careful of that. They were small groups, but you could say a renewal group. But Judy was invited to start doing pastoral care for vineyard pastors in the USA, in Houston, which is her hometown.
Okay, so pastoral care, again, related to the counseling aspect. So these pastors come and they are sharing.
They're
burned out. Yeah, yeah. And so, and then you're able to help guide them through that difficult time, basically. That's
right.
What,
and
yeah.
I was invited to come and join the staff of the Sugarland Vineyard near Houston, in the Houston area, in Texas. And there was a problem. The board didn't want a woman in that position. So my boss had to hire a young man and put him out front. And I stood behind him, but I created the retreats and created the team, trained the team, and led the retreats. He was my
That's what's in this book.
When was that written? Just so I know. When was that written?
It was published 2015.
Okay.
But I wrote it over a period of 7 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you know what I want to do, because of where we are in the story. I want to have another. I think there's too much still to go.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're open to that, I'd love to be able to continue it, because there are so many questions still about all these things
we became together.
And I find it fascinating what you were saying about the Lutheran, Anglican, Catholic, you know, all this starts to meld together, and the brotherhood and sisterhood that can form there. So if you're okay with it, I want to leave it here.
Yeah.
And we're going to pick this up again, because I think there's so much more to unpack.
Okay.
Fine.
Sure.
Awesome. Excellent.
Okay.
All right. Well, everyone, we're going to leave it there. Part 2 will come out next week. And until next time, take care and God bless. Bye.